Let's start with why you decided to retire, and will you miss the job?
I've been SAC here in San Antonio for 8 wonderful years, and I've been in the FBI for 26. So at a certain point, it's time to go. I've loved this job, I love the FBI, and I love San Antonio. And I think at this point in time, it's time to move on, go to the private sector, contribute in a different way. I'm not really sure what that's going to be yet, but the time is now.
Talk about San Antonio, because you were not a native. I mean, did you know anything about San Antonio before you came here?
I'd never been to San Antonio. I was frankly ordered to come here, and I was like, hey, I'm from New York. Why are you sending me to Texas? But the minute I got here, I realized I'm never leaving. And in fact, right now, I'm the longest serving SAC in the FBI, because I told the people in Washington, I will never go back to Washington. I am not leaving San Antonio.
What is it that you like about it so much?
It's such a different city, and I think it's hard for people that have lived here all their lives. It's a very friendly city. It's not expensive. You can afford to have a family here and do fun things. And the difference between all the cities I've lived in is just that everybody's happy here. It's a great community. Everybody gets along. It's a great place to raise a family. Growing up on the East Coast, everything is hard. And here, it's just a wonderful atmosphere.
Is the hardest part of your job being the face, kind of the local face of the FBI? Is that a challenge for you? Was it a challenge for you? How do you see that?
You know, it's not hard being the SAC in this town. I think in some towns it could be hard. But what I've found in San Antonio is this community supports law enforcement, whether it's local, state, or federal. And everywhere I go, when people recognize who I am, I get a thank you, I get honest questions, which I've always enjoyed answering. I've never felt attacked by people or the media. This is a wonderful media environment as well. And that's why I love it here so much, is I think people respect what we're trying to do, they support us. Even through the bad stories that get out and the good, I've always felt it's been very fair here, and the people of San Antonio support all of us in law enforcement.
When you look back on whether it's your 8 years as SAC or the 26 that you've been with the Bureau, what are the events that stand out in your memory?
I think the biggest event in my career was being at the Pentagon on 9/11, 6 minutes after that plane hit. And then I was the FBI commander at the Pentagon on 9/11. You can imagine, obviously, the emotions and being there and witnessing history the way it was. Pertaining to this job, my 8 years in Texas, I think the high point is what the FBI was able to accomplish with our partners in Austin during the serial bomber. And although 2 people died, which was very tragic, that could have been so much worse. And because of the effort we put into that, we brought 600 FBI agents into Austin. We were able to catch that bomber, working with the Austin police, working with the state police, the ATF, all of the partners. And we saved lives there, and I'm very proud of that. On the flip side of that, I think probably the hardest thing I've ever done, and in particular to us here in San Antonio, was the Sutherland Springs church massacre. I've been to 5 active shooters. That was one of them. That was the worst thing I've ever been involved with. The tragedy of it, the horror of it. But again, the good that came out of that was how law enforcement, the fire service responded to that, working through that horrific event and being able to help as much as we did.
I remember seeing you there, and you just arrived on the scene, and I think we shook hands and didn't even really say anything to each other. But I was struck by just how quiet everything was. You had media from all over the state there. You had law enforcement, local, state, federal, but it was quiet. I mean, it was eerily quiet, like almost everybody was in mourning. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, in fact, I remember you were the first person I saw there. We pulled up, I jumped out of my cruiser, I saw you, and you looked at me and said, hey, this is really bad. And that was the first time it kind of hit me. And I could see it in your face, and then when I went up there and saw the horror that was there. And it was an eerie quiet, and it was a respectful quiet. You know, what I found on most crisis scenes, it's incredibly loud. There's a chaos. You can feel it. There's almost an energy that somewhat generates there. And what was striking about Sutherland Springs was there was no energy. It was deadly quiet. Everybody realized the magnitude of how horrible that was. And probably one of the quietest scenes I've ever been at.
Is it hard? Obviously, you had a job to do, but it's got to be hard to divorce your personal feelings from the job that you had to do walking into that church that day.
It's hard, and you know, we don't really divorce ourselves. I think that's what people believe, but you know, FBI agents are just people, right? And that horror affected us greatly. It affects me to this day. It affects my people to this day. Like, that's just horror. That it's horror, and it's horrible, and unless you've been in there and seen something like that, it's hard to even describe it to you, what that can do. But I think what happened there was a respect for the victims, working with those families to help them through that horror, working with the community to try to rebuild. So I am proud as to what we did there and how we helped. But again, it's hard to even talk about it to this day because it was just such a bad event. And you know, to me, I'm a good Christian man, and to see that in a church hit me even more. You know, the horror of an active shooter is one thing, but to me, the horror of the active shooter at that church on that Sunday and the things that we saw just magnified it by 100 times.
Yeah, for me, it was, you know, I know towns like Sutherland Springs. I grew up in a town in southwest Iowa that's not that much bigger than Sutherland Springs. So that's what I just kept thinking over and over in my head. But how have you seen the agency change? Like, there has to be technology changes and you know, personnel changes and how you go about your job that have changed drastically, I would think, over the 26 years.
Yep. I mean, it's changed a lot. You know, when I joined the FBI, we didn't have phones. We had one computer for each squad. We had to take turns on the computers. So things like that obviously have changed. With the technology, certainly it allows us some greater investigative resources than we had before. Yeah. But it still comes down to you have to have great people to do great things. And you could have every technology in the world, and if you don't have a dedicated FBI employee behind it, it's not going to help. And I think, although the people change and the faces change, I'm 100% confident that the young FBI people today are as dedicated, maybe even smarter and more dedicated than we were when I started. And that continues. And you know, there's a lot of noise out there, but the brass tacks comes down to the same. There are great Americans that join the FBI and in law enforcement to serve their country and serve their community, and I have not seen a change there.
Well, there are things I learned about you getting ready for this interview that I did not know before. Obviously, I knew you were a New Yorker. I knew you used to be a firefighter.
Right.
I did not know that you were an expert on terrorism, domestic terrorism, obviously what happened after 9/11, kind of a critical decision-making expert. Did not know you were a fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Mm-hmm. I mean, all those things are amazing to me, that you have this varied a background. How do you want to be thought of as you wrap up your FBI career?
It's a tough question. Boy, I didn't think about that. I got to think for a second before I answer that.
I'll come back to that one.
No, that's all right. Let me just focus on it for a second. I think what I really hope my legacy here is building a great team within the FBI and with the partners. You know, something that's very important to me is the FBI's relationship with the local police, the state police, the other federal agencies, and I've really focused on that. And I think we have unbelievable relationships in the state of Texas, and in particular San Antonio. And I think we have built here in FBI San Antonio a very unique team that goes after the hard cases, that works with our partners hand in hand. It's not about credit for the FBI. It's about helping the community. And I hope that continues. And it will continue, because I think we've laid a foundation, and the men and women here that are staying after I leave, I think that's bred into them, and I'm very proud of that.
What concerns you most once you leave the Bureau? Because obviously the Bureau continues.
Right.
Whether Christopher Combs is part of it or
Correct.
not.
Correct.
But what are your biggest fears? What are your biggest concerns out there?
Of all the threats that are out there, the one that I'm concerned about today, and I will be 6 months from now, even when I'm out, and the real threat that we're very focused on here is the threat to the Jewish community. We saw it recently up in Dallas. It's something we've seen around the country, where there's been multiple active shooters at Jewish schools or Jewish temples, Jewish delis in New York. That's a very real threat, and I see that threat increasing, and it's very concerning. So we spend a lot of our time here. Our domestic terrorism squad here and in Austin is very dedicated to looking at that threat and to making sure that we're ahead of it, that we're identifying the people that are threatening the Jewish community. We're going after them, we're locking them up to make sure that we don't have any more takeovers, any more shootings. That's what really concerns me.
Is domestic terrorism also, just in a broader sense, something you're concerned about?
I think the title of domestic terrorism has been pulled in different directions, and frankly, I think sometimes it's a political hot potato and people pull it the way they want. If you break down what does domestic terrorism mean, what are we really worried about, and where do we see the actual violence? I think it's to the Jewish community, and I think that's where we should focus our resources. I can tell you that's where we focus them here, whether it's San Antonio, whether it's Austin. That's the concern, and that's where I really think we have to pay more attention.
If somebody says, why is crime so high? What's your answer to that?
I think it's very easy to describe why crime is so high. There's two factors. If you don't support law enforcement and we don't prosecute people that commit crime, you're going to have more crime. I really don't think this is a hard formula, and it kind of boggles me that this is debated so often. If we don't support the men and women in law enforcement, and then once they do arrest people, if they're not prosecuted, we're going to have more crime. When you look at the majority of people that commit crime, it's people that have a historical record of committing crime. Very few people commit one crime. When you look at it, people have been in jail, have been arrested 8, 9, 10 times. Those are the people that need to be in jail because they're going to commit more crime. So that we can solve this problem. We can solve this crime problem by supporting law enforcement at all levels and by prosecuting people who commit crime and put them in jail.
Guns, the proliferation of guns on the street, easier to get a gun, especially in the state of Texas now, than it used to be. Is that also a factor?
Guns are always a factor. Guns have always been available. The problem is, if you arrest somebody who commits a crime with a gun and they don't go to jail, they're going to commit another crime with a gun. So the answer there is, if you commit a crime with a gun, you should go to jail, get an enhancement for the use of a firearm, and then they can't get out to do another crime with the jail.
Yeah, simple.
I think it's very simple. People who commit crimes will commit them again. If they use a gun, they're going to use a gun again. They have to go to jail and be held responsible.
Some people, I want to clarify, because there are going to be some people who are going to watch this and say, how do you balance some of the things like you saw with George Floyd in Minneapolis and support law enforcement? I always have made the point, it's not an either or proposition. I just kind of want I want you to clarify a little bit on that aspect.
I think that's a simple formula as well. Bad police officers should be removed from the force and held accountable. People who commit crime should be held accountable. It's not hard. You can support law enforcement. Believe me, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop, because it hurts all of us. What happened in Minneapolis was wrong. That police officer was tried and went to jail. Every cop in America supports that. That's not a question. But the other 99% of law enforcement who are good people that defend people we don't know and put our lives on the line have to be supported. It's not an either or. You can support the police while you also want bad police officers fired and in jail.
And when you brought up San Antonio earlier, in the polling that we've seen, we do a bare facts poll, we see that. Mm-hmm. Overwhelming support for police officers, but also concern about bad police officers. I mean, you can hold both those things in your mind is what we have seen in the polling. Right. I want to finish this interview.
Can I jump on that with something else?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say this to you. There are bad police officers. There's doctors who do bad things. There are librarians. There are media people that do bad things. Every group, no matter what you are, has a 1 or 2% that aren't doing the right thing. The answer is to focus on the 1 or 2%, not to tear down the institution. You know, there are doctors that have malpractice problems. There are police officers that break the law. Those people should be dealt with, but you don't tear down the institution of the medical profession. You don't tear down the institution of law enforcement. So I think that's the difference, and unfortunately, we have focused on the worst 1 or 2% of law enforcement and painted everybody with that brush. And that's wrong. And that's wrong with any group. You can't look at any group and go after their worst 1% or everybody's in trouble.
Yeah. Very few things in life are black and white. There's always a lot of gray.
Correct.
I want to finish this by talking about a young Christopher Combs. Would he have ever imagined all the things that you've gone through over the 26 years that you've been with the FBI?
So I'll tell you, since the day I was born, I think I was bred into a good Irish Catholic family where you were a cop or you were a firefighter. I've accomplished both. I don't think I ever thought I'd be the special agent in charge of the FBI, certainly not in Texas, in San Antonio. So that's certainly a surprise. The FBI has given me so much. San Antonio has given me so much. I couldn't change anything, and I wouldn't want to. It has been a gift. It's been a gift from God. I believe in this job I've served God, and that was my calling. And you know, I'm happy to walk out after 26 years at a great career, at a great FBI, in a great city. I really am.